This part deals with how to open a number of elements that are required to make it possible to reproduce and replicate a study. Open methods, materials, and code. If a study is made to be reproducible, it should include methods that are detailed enough, code for analysis and/or simulations or experiments, depending on what applies, and if applicable, also materials used in the study and data. Open data will be the focus of the next unit, but the other parts are the basis of what we will cover now. One of the outcomes of the replication crisis in psychology was to reveal how much the information included in scientific articles falls short of what is necessary to reproduce studies. Open methodology, materials, and code can participate in fixing this. Open methodology means that the methodology of a paper is accessible to all and described in sufficient detail for it to be replicated if need be. Within the papers, one proposed initiative is the so-called 21-word solution. The idea there is that if you are not p-hacking and doing everything by the book, you should say so in your method section. It's also a way to push forward transparency by disclosing what was done exactly, and the hope is that in the long run it will normalize disclosure of methodological decisions and change general norms about asking for methodological details. The 21-word solution is a statement which illustrates that this can be done briefly, using only 21 words, and was also a way to fight against arguments suggesting that being transparent would require more space and more words than allowed by journals. One related problem is that some journals have fixed length for the method section of the articles they publish, and in this case, it is always possible to publish parts of the methods that wouldn't fit within the manuscript as supplemental materials, including this 21-word statement. Another way to make sure that your manuscript includes enough information to reproduce your study is to ask a colleague or friend who ideally doesn't know your study to read through your methods and to point you at any piece of information you might be missing. Another useful tool to help you report all the necessary information to make your study transparent is the transparency checklist. It was established by a large community of researchers for social and behavioral sciences. As mentioned by the authors themselves, when you open the app on which you can fill the checklist, it is best suited for confirmatory research using primary data. Primary data means data that were collected by researchers directly from main sources through interviews, surveys, experiments, etc. Even if it is best fitting one given type of report, it can still help to look at it and consider what could be used for different types of research. It also generates a transparency report which sums up all your answers. So let's have a look at the short version of the transparency checklist. The first part asks about preregistration. The first question asks whether, prior to analyzing the complete dataset, a timestamp preregistration was posted in an independent third-party registry for the data analysis plan. The second question asks at which time or step in the study your preregistration occurred. For instance, before any data were collected, after data were collected but before any look was given at them, etc. The third and last question of the preregistration section asks whether the preregistration fully describes the intended statistical analysis for each research question. And by fully describes, it means provides a number of details, including things like sightedness of test, inference criteria, which means significance threshold, correction for multiple testing if necessary, procedure for model selection, prior distributions used in the case of Bayesian analysis, etc., etc. The second part of the checklist addresses the method section of your manuscript. In this section, you have to answer whether your manuscript fully describes the following thing: the rationale for the sample size you used, the study design, procedures, and materials well enough to allow independent replication, the measures of interest and their operationalization, and finally, any changes to the preregistration. The third part of the checklist addresses the results and discussion section of your manuscript. The only question there is whether your manuscript distinguishes explicitly between confirmatory pre-specified analysis and exploratory or not pre-specified analysis. Finally, the last part of the checklist focuses on whether data, code, and materials are available. You have to answer what has been made publicly available among the following: the data on which the analyses were based, all code and software, all instructions, stimuli, and test materials. Finally, the very last question asks whether, on top of having these different elements available, the manuscript includes a statement about the availability and location of these different elements. Ideally, you should be able to answer yes to all these questions. The transparency checklist also offers a possibility to add comments to explain or detail your answers to any of the questions. Now, let's consider what you can do outside of the paper to make your study easy to reproduce or reuse. Ensuring the reproducibility and transparency of your research methods usually implies to share your materials and code. This includes adopting good practices both while coding and while sharing your code, and knowing which platforms you can use for that. As we have seen in the case of other practices, there are different degrees or levels of openness, and that's the case for open code too. It's one thing to make sure that your code is open and accessible online, but part of making your research reproducible is to code in a way that keeps that in mind. There are ways to make your code easier for others to understand and reuse so that they can build on it, and that's what we will get into now. So now, what are some important aspects of a reproducible workflow? First, you should clearly separate, label, and document all data, files, and operations that occur on data and files. Second, you should document all operations fully, automating them as much as possible and avoiding manual intervention in the workflow when feasible. This will be back in other forms later, but manual manipulation is a source of errors, and of errors that are not reproducible on top of it. So you should avoid them as much as possible. Third and last, you should design a workflow as a sequence of small steps that are glued together, with intermediate outputs from one step feeding into the next step as inputs. This makes the structure a lot more robust and easy to use, and we'll get into more details on how to do this next. Here are some more rules that you can keep in mind in order to make your code and computational research reproducible. Rule number 1, for every result, keep track of how it was produced. In other words, as a minimum, you should record sufficient details on programs, parameters, and all procedures to allow your future self to approximately reproduce the results. Rule number 2, again, avoid manual data manipulation steps. Manual data manipulation is more prone to errors, and such steps would be hard to reproduce. As much as possible, rely on the execution of programs instead of manual procedures to modify data. If you really cannot avoid manual manipulations, make sure to note down what these manual procedures are, and in as much details as possible. Rule number 3, archive the exact version of all external programs used. If you do not, your code might end up not working because some version of some of the programs you used would have changed between the time at which the code was written and the time at which someone else tries to run or use it. Rule number 4, version control all custom scripts, which brings us to version control. Good scientific computing practices matter to open science, also to the extent that they allow to work collaboratively. Version control is a system that records changes to a file or to a set of files over time so that you can recall specific versions later. It is especially useful for collaborative work and if you are coding or writing with one or more collaborators. In more practical terms, using version control means that if you write a code and make a change which, for whichever reason, does not work, you can revert your code back to the previous version you asked the system to record. A collaborative network using version control can also be centralized or distributed. In a centralized version control system, there is a central copy of your project somewhere, usually on a server, and programmers will commit, which means apply their changes to this central copy. By contrast, in a distributed version control system, every user has a local copy of the repository in addition to the central repository on the server side, and they can commit their changes to their own local repository. Uploading changes to a main shared and remote repository is then done by using those pull and push requests. Now, back to our 10 rules for reproducible scientific computing. Rule number 5, record all intermediate results and when possible in standardized format. This is good practice even for yourself and for debugging, by the way, as it breaks your computations in smaller units. And you can notice discrepancies or weird results at the stage at which they occur rather than only on the final results. Additionally, if for some reason it is not always possible to rerun all your code all the time, for instance, because of the computational costs, it allows to run only the relevant part of your code. Rule number 6, for analyses that include randomness, note the underlying random seeds. This is because when you use analysis including randomness, their outcomes are going to depend on the random seed. So if you want to be able to have the same outcome again, you'll need to know what the random seed was. Rule number 7, always store raw data behind plots. You can recover the plot from the raw data, but recovering raw data from the plot is at best difficult and time-consuming, so do yourself a favor and make sure that you save the raw data you used for your plots. Rule number 8, generate hierarchical analysis output, allowing layers of increasing detail to be inspected. A more straightforward way to put that is, as much as possible, avoid working with and reporting only summary values, but also provide ways to access and analyze raw values whenever possible. There are some statistical tests which can be run both by using some summary measures, for instance, mean and standard deviation, but even for this kind of test, it's still better to run the test on raw values directly. Rule number 9, connect textual statements to underlying results. In other words, while writing up your results and interpretation of the results, it should be clear which computation results you are discussing. Conversely, you can also comment your code to link computation results and textual statements. Rule number 10, provide public access to scripts, runs, and results. As a minimum, you should provide the data and source code that are needed to reproduce the results you report. You can provide them as supplementary materials along your paper, or provide the link where they are hosted. It is even better if you provide public access not only to your scripts and results, but also to your runs, meaning to any information on how running your script went. For instance, it can include things like running time and outputs of intermediary steps before final results. If you want even more advice on how to optimize your scientific computing, and not necessarily just with regards to reproducibility, there are a number of references and resources I would recommend. That includes a paper by Wilson and colleagues on best practices for scientific computing, carpentry, both for data and software, and the Turing way, who we have already encountered. There are also a number of online communities who discuss code sharing and related practices which you can turn to, and that includes, for instance, Stack Exchange and GitHub. And here are some platforms you can use for code sharing. GitHub is probably the most used one, in part because it works nicely with Git, which is a version control system. Bitbucket and GitLab are two other pretty domain general platforms you can use to share your code. Finally, ModelDB is an example of a domain-specific place you can use to share your code, and it's specialized in computational neuroscience. The first thing to know about licensing is that it matters because it determines what your code or software can be used for and how. Open source refers to software for which the source, meaning the human-readable form of the code, is openly available with unrestricted access by all. But access to the source code isn't enough for your code to be really open. And you might want to add free for free open source. So adding free refers to the form of license applied to the code or software and what is allowed or not to do with the code. Free open source software is defined as any computer program released under a license that grants the user rights to run the program for any purpose, to study it, to modify it, and to redistribute it, either in its original form or modified. This definition is by opposition to proprietary, non-free, or closed-source softwares, who don't have these characteristics. Now, getting into more details on how licenses for codes and software work, licensing a code usually means that the code is copyrighted. If a code is not copyrighted, it is simply public domain, and there is no restrictions on what can be done with it. Once a code is copyrighted, there are two options. It can either be under a proprietary license or under a free open source software license. There are then two further types of free open source software licenses: non-copyleft or permissive licenses on the one hand, and copyleft licenses on the other. Copyleft licenses are reciprocal and protective because they ensure that any work derived from the one under copyleft licenses has, at the minimum, the same rights as the original work. By contrast, non-copyleft licenses are permissive. They do not include the same requirements of maintaining similar rights. There are a number of resources you can use to help you with figuring out how to license your code and which license in particular you should pick. You should prefer, as much as possible, licenses that are pretty common to custom ones. Resources include the Free Software Foundation, the Open Source Initiative, and the Debian and Fedora projects. GitHub also has some resources about licensing, and it's actually a relevant point to mention here, but having your code freely accessible on GitHub is not enough to make it free open source, and you would need to add a license on it which ensures the rights we mentioned. We will also get into more details of one of the most common and general types of licenses, the Creative Commons license, in the unit on publishing. Sharing your materials is also important for your study's reproducibility, and it increases the robustness of your work through time and makes it, among other things, more likely to survive changes of hardware. You can use a number of platforms that offer storage space to share your materials. That's the case of Open Science Framework, Zenodo, or GitHub, for instance. In any case, if you share your materials, make sure to provide a link to access them in your manuscript. Finally, a DOI is a digital object identifier, and it might be a good idea to give one to your materials. A DOI is a stable and permanent way to refer to your content, which makes it especially important in ensuring access to it. It is automatically attributed to articles by journals upon publication, but can actually be used for a number of different contents and independently of scientific publishers. A DOI can also be attributed, for instance, to a dataset or to materials used in a study, as long as they are available online. One platform you can use to attribute a DOI to any type of materials you want would be Zenodo. Other specific platforms we encountered for different functions can also provide DOIs for the type of contents they host. OSF, Open Science Framework, for instance, can provide DOIs for projects, preregistrations, or preprints. Preprints repositories also usually provide DOIs for preprints. And overall, having a DOI associated to your materials makes them more accessible, and so for longer time periods. That also applies to your data.